Australian ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, tells CNA there's been a notable shift in China's ideological perspective, influencing its behaviour domestically and internationally. Well, I spoke earlier with the former Australian Prime Minister who attended the Milken Initiative Global Conference in Los Angeles.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist party, and it communicates its messages to its 100 million members in large part through ideological forms of communication, not just in terms of policy edicts. And if you examine carefully the content and the tenor of China's ideological pronouncements, I think it's important to see three big changes under Xi Jinping. China has become more Leninist in terms of the power of the party over the state and the individual. It has become more Marxist in its economic policy settings, and we see that through a greater emphasis on the party and the state as opposed to the market and the private sector. And thirdly, if there's one other large ideological change, it's what we see with the rise of various official forms of Chinese nationalism in support of a much more assertive approach in Chinese foreign and security policy. You see these three underlying ideological changes flowing through into China's policy apparatus under Xi Jinping's leadership over the last decade.
And seeing how assertive China has become, as you've mentioned, we've had the latest incident at the Yellow Sea, for example, where Chinese fighter jet fired flares at an Australian chopper, and you've got the South China Sea against the Philippines, or in the East China Sea with Japan. So help us understand this, because as China's military and economic power that continues to grow, is the world witnessing a new era, perhaps, of Chinese aggression, or is it just Beijing simply flexing its muscles to assert its place on a global stage?
Well, remember, it was Xi Jinping himself who, back in 2014, 10 years ago, effectively pronounced the end of Deng Xiaoping's 35-year-long doctrine of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. And the Chinese was 韬光养晦，绝不当头. And this was pushed to one side in favor of a new official Chinese foreign and security policy doctrine of striving for achievement, 奋发有为, which has been interpreted both by the Chinese diplomats and by Chinese military apparatus as justifying a much more assertive approach in the world. We saw, for example, a long period of Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy, and we see now China's continuing efforts to assert its military interests, its territorial interests, its security policy interests in the immediate region, not just in terms of Taiwan, the East China Sea and the South China Sea, but recently and most curiously in terms of the Australian operation, which is part of a UN operation adjacent to the Yellow Sea, enforcing sanctions against North Korea.
So first there was Japan, and then now South Korea, confirming about AUKUS talks on joining the Defence Pact on sharing military technology, no doubt ruffling China's feathers. How do we ensure that AUKUS does not potentially become a destabilizing force in the region?
Well, the first thing to be very clear about is that AUKUS, which brings together Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, is not a defence security treaty. It is a collaborative arrangement for sharing and developing common defence platforms, common defence weapon systems, common defence technologies. One part of AUKUS deals, of course, with the Australian government's sovereign decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. And that is what we have done through what is called AUKUS Pillar 1. The second area of AUKUS is to create an increasingly seamless market between Australia, the UK and the United States in all other realms of defence science and industry and technology. Now, in terms of that latter area of collaboration, and that work is still ongoing between the three governments. And what they've decided to do is to embrace the possibility of opening up collaboration on common defence projects with the government of Japan and possibly other governments as well. This is a normal set of developments evolving over time. And that's against the background of what I can only describe as look at, for example, the data produced by the International Institute of Strategic Studies and the IISS, which, as you know, hosts the Shangri-La Dialogue, will release from time to time data pointing to the significant increase in Chinese military expenditure over many decades now. The size of the Chinese surface fleet now being, in numerical terms, larger than that of the United States Navy. And so these patterns of Chinese military development have generated their equal and opposite reactions on the part of many countries within the region, and not just US allies. Look, for example, at the pattern of the expansion of Singapore's own military expenditure as well. We're all preoccupied with the central change factor in the overall strategic stability of the region, which is China's increased military outlays and increasingly inserted pattern of military behaviours, exercises, etc., of the type we've seen most recently in the Yellow Sea.
And Ambassador, as China's President Xi Jinping continues his first tour of Europe in 5 years as we speak, there are concerns that Beijing is perhaps seeking to exploit existing divisions within NATO and the EU. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, China at present, both in relation to Germany, most recently with Chancellor Scholz's visit to Beijing and Xi Jinping's visit to Paris, but more broadly, Chinese diplomacy in Europe and the world at large are seeking to normalize China's relations with these large economies after a period of what we would describe as abnormality in the relationship. Remember, the underlying European concern in relation to China is China's continued decision to provide all manner of economic and financial and material support to Russia at a time when Russia has conducted a full-scale territorial invasion of another sovereign member state of the United Nations, namely Ukraine. And that actually constitutes the fundamental tension in Europe-China relations. If there's a second one, it's China now exporting many of its domestic manufacturing surpluses at scale around the world. Most recently, of course, we see evidence of friction between the Europeans and China on the question of electric vehicles and the impact which that has on Europe's own domestic motor vehicle manufacturing sector. Put all those things together, you see a whole range of fundamental structural tensions in the Europe-China relationship. I imagine President Xi Jinping is seeking to respond to some of those concerns during his current visit. But remember, NATO will soon celebrate its 75th anniversary in Washington in July this year. And if anything, the NATO alliance has become stronger rather than weaker. And furthermore, NATO in recent years, because of China's actions in Ukraine, has now developed its own level of internal dialogue concerning China's challenge to the international rules-based system.
And when considering potential US-China conflict, what scenarios keep you up at night? And how do you think Australia can contribute to mitigating all these risks?
Well, all of us in the Indo-Pacific region are focused on one thing. How do we sustain the peace by sustaining strategic equilibrium across the Indo-Pacific? How is that achieved in turn by maintaining an appropriate military balance? And how, in effect, do we apply deterrence in relation to the possibility of China taking unilateral military action against Taiwan, or for that matter, in the South China Sea or the East China Sea against US treaty allies? Deterrence is the principal means by which strategic stability is preserved, and the principal means by which, therefore, other nations, including those in Southeast Asia, get to choose their own foreign policy futures, their own national futures, rather than believing that the region is simply tilting in one direction over time. I think that's the primary challenge in which we're all engaged: deterrence, strategic equilibrium in order to sustain the peace. That, I think, is what occupies most political and, frankly, diplomatic advisors and military leaders across the Indo-Pacific region at the moment as we deal with some of these unprecedented strategic challenges.
Mr. Rudd, just one final question. What is your favorite Chinese proverb when you're engaging with Chinese counterparts? What would it be?
It's not exactly a proverb, but I often say, 天不怕地不怕只怕陆客文说中国话, which is there's nothing on heaven to fear, there's nothing on earth to fear. Anything to fear is people like Kevin Rudd speaking Chinese. Thank you very much.